I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the fighting raging across the Donbas, and Dom Nicholls answers your questions.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 25th of May, day 91. And today I'm joined by the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, Dominic Nicholls. Before we get into the fighting in the Donbas, I asked Dom for the other key updates from Ukraine.
Well, hi David, and hi everybody. It really is focused on the Donbas. That we're going to talk about it at length in a little while. But that is the show in town, and that speaks volumes of the fight there, which we'll come back to. Russia really are not doing an awful lot else because they diverted everything into that area. But we'll come back to that. Just worth noting elsewhere on the sort of political stage. We've seen Italy and Hungary urging the EU to push for a truce, but at the same time, Estonia's Prime Minister says that we've got to avoid, this is a quote, must avoid a bad peace for Ukraine. So these we've talked in the past about what is tension, what is healthy debate amongst democracies, and we've also said that Vladimir Putin and apologists will love to get in those small d divisions and try and push them apart. It's a live debate about what's happening at the moment. We've seen these articles in the New York Times, and we saw Henry Kissinger's comments, and equally we've seen a couple of arguments on the other side of the debate saying, no, there should be absolute defeat. Russia needs to be absolutely defeated. We're in the same position as Munich, 1938. So in The Atlantic, two great articles from Anne Applebaum and Elliot Cohen arguing that, no, we've got to defeat. Russia must be seen to be defeated. This is the moment when autocracy needs to learn that there's a limit to what it can do. That debate is very live and ongoing. Just briefly elsewhere, Andrei Rudenko, Russia's deputy foreign minister, said that he was talking about prisoner swaps. This idea of after the surrender of the Ukrainian fighters in the Azovstal plant, what's going to happen to them? And he said, well, of course we talk about prisoner swaps, but he said after, and there's a quote, an appropriate convictions and sentencing. So a very loaded term. We know that Russia are keen to portray the Azov battalion as neo-Nazis and harking back after that. After the part that they have had a right-wing leaning past in some areas, they say that they've expunged that from their ranks now. However, Russia's still very keen to play that line. So talk of prisoner swaps after an appropriate conviction and sentencing is concerning. And he was also talking about the humanitarian passage, maritime passage, to get grain supplies out of Odessa and out of Ukraine through the Black Sea and out to the world. Again, a subject we've spoken about at length here on the pod, about what the effect this is having on the wider world. And Rudenko was saying, yeah, of course, absolutely, anything's possible there. We'd be delighted to help Ukraine get its grain supplies out when there's an appropriate accommodation and lowering of sanctions against Russia. This is gangsterism. They're threatening with one hand, saying, stop making me punch you in the face, type of thing. So it's pure gangsterism. I don't think these are reasonable or in any way honest offers from Russia to get the grain supply moving again. But it's just yet again from the playbook of making us think that they're going to do one thing. And if we've learned anything from the last few months about Russia, when it comes to this, it's actions speak much louder than the words. I just simply don't believe when you say them to my face. I was in Moscow with the defence secretary when Shoigu and Gerasimov were saying no plans at all to invade Ukraine, and obviously look what happened. So actions, not words, please, Mr. Rudenko.
Well, let's move on to the Russian offensive in the Donbas. Ukrainian officials have said that the fate of the country could be decided in the ongoing fighting in the region. Can we talk a little bit about where are we talking about? What's actually in play?
So the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine, the Donetsk coal basin, which is the two oblasts, the two regions Ukraine's made up of 24 regions, 24 oblasts, 2 of them in the east of the country, Luhansk to the north and Donetsk to the south. So the Donbas is the predominantly sort of Russia-leaning area of Ukraine. By no means total. However, since the 2014 invasion, that area has been sort of led by Russian separatist movements, People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk. Now, after the invasion on February 24th, Russia tried to go into the north to try to take Kyiv in a lightning strike, 72-hour strike in the north. And that obviously they were pushed back and eventually ejected from the country. And at that point, this is about 6 weeks ago, at that point, President Putin said, well, that was all a feint. That was just a diversion. Actually, the main effort all along was the Donbas and securing, or in his words, liberating the Russian-speaking people of the Donbas from the yoke of Ukrainian Nazi rule. And so they pushed their forces into the east. Now, at the time, the sensible defence analysts were saying, well, okay, it's going to take weeks to reconstitute and just to briefly reiterate, reconstituting a force means regenerating, so fixing the broken people and equipment, and reorganising. So you might say that we need these brigades to be more armour heavy, so more tanks, fewer infantry, or you might say we need more engineers up front because there's lots of minefields and rivers and what have you. So reorganising your forces takes time because it's not just about telling soldier A to get on and work well with soldier B. They've got to train, they've got to practice together, they've got to understand each other's strengths and weaknesses. I mean, down to how fast your vehicles go. So when I'm in the attack, when I'm in the advance, assaulting an enemy position, are you physically going to be able to keep up with me? Our Challenger and Chieftain tanks were able to go about the same speed as Warrior, which was quite helpful. About 20 miles an hour across broken ground, much faster on hard ground. And you have to have that when you're in the assault. You can't have your tanks going ahead of the infantry and vice versa. So all these really sort of low level bits and pieces need to be worked out. And you can't just launch straight into a fight. But that's what we saw Russia do. They wanted a victory. We thought May the 9th was going to be a significant date, the day of Moscow's Victory Day parade, the annual event marking the victory over Nazi Germany in the Second World War. So we thought May the 9th was going to be significant. And it seems to have been such that they then sort of threw forces into the Donbas without a proper time to reconstitute. So tired fighters, tired equipment, broken structures, and they met the same staunch resistance as they had before from Ukraine. And in the last couple of weeks, they've been largely ejected from the north and northeast of Kharkiv, Ukraine's second city. Certainly pushed right to the edge of, if not beyond, artillery range. So Kharkiv has been absolutely pounded for the 3 months of this war, and a lot of that was from this really heavy artillery just raining down on civilians. And so to be able to push those forces back, and in some places to the border, was very significant by Ukraine. And I think that was largely down to them able to knit together very small counter attacks that could kind of blend into one big counter offensive, if you like. But Russia just weren't able to resist that. Their forces were tired. And we've seen that to a greater degree in the Donbas. They've not been advancing in anything like the rate that you would expect a fully swept up, modern, well-trained, well-equipped, well-led army to do. I mean, they've been creeping forward at about a mile a day, so in the last few days we're talking about the pocket of Severodonetsk. This is a major city in the Donbas held by Ukraine that is in danger of encirclement, and looks like it will be encircled in the next few days. But this is a major reduction in ambition, even after Russia said that the Donbas was their main objective. I mean, we thought they were going to draw a line south from Kharkiv and north from Mariupol and sort of sweep down in some massive encirclement operation and then slowly attrit the Ukrainian forces inside that. They've not been able to do that, so they've gone for these much smaller encirclements, and as I say, inching forward, mile after mile per day. So this hasn't been some huge breakthrough in the Donbas. It's been done because they are doing what they should have been doing, combined arms manoeuvre. So the infantry working with the tanks, working with the engineers, working with aviation, so helicopters and air, to achieve results. But it's only been in the last sort of 10 days or so it's really started to gain any momentum, and that is about 6 weeks after they were rejected from the north. So it would suggest that General Alexander Dvornikov, who was put in overall command of Russia's war effort, seems to have, after the ejection from the north, seems to have sort of tried to keep his boss quiet, keep Putin quiet by saying, okay, fine, we'll roll straight into the Donbas, and they've been mauled. But at the same time, he does seem to have given some time to his formations underneath his command to reconstitute properly. And I think that's what we've seen in the last 10 days. But it's still nothing like the advance they should have been making. We can talk whys and the wherefores about that and what might come next in a moment.
Thanks, Dom. Before we went on air, you were speaking a little bit about the some insights you had about the Russian equipment, specifically the tanks. Do you want to go into that? Obviously, we've known since the beginning of the war the Russian army has been losing a huge number of armoured vehicles and tanks, and they are really starting to scrape the barrel in terms of the things they're putting on the battlefield.
Yeah. So all through this campaign, we have seen Ukrainian forces work brilliantly well in these small anti-tank teams, so supplied by anti-tank weapons mainly from outside the country. I think they wore through their stocks pretty quickly, but you've had the US Javelin, the Anglo-Swedish produced NLAW, the next generation light anti-tank weapon, and others as well from other countries have all been pushed into theatre. And these have been hugely effective at destroying armoured vehicles, in particular tanks. And we've seen in the last few days that Russia has thousands of tanks in deep storage. I mean, most armies do. The British Army, we've got Ludgershall just on Salisbury Plain. We've got warehouses full of old chieftains covered in grease, ready to go at a moment's notice, as long as that moment is about a year. So they've got all these tanks in storage, and we've just seen images in the last couple of days of T-62 tanks being put on trains and pushed towards Ukraine. And this, on the one hand, it's not good. They've got access to a lot more heavy metal. But let's have a look at the T-62. It is, as the name suggests, it was kind of designed in the about 60 years ago. It was actually designed in the 50s, came into service in the 60s, and this is old stuff. It's old technology. So if and when they break, I mean, are they still making spare parts for T-62s? I doubt it. They've probably all been, the ones that are able to go forward have all been cannibalised from others in stock. And the main armament is 115 mil. So still makes a big bang when it arrives at you, but it's different from the 125 mil of the T-72 80s and 90s that they've mainly been using. So what does that mean? Well, think of the logistic chains for that. Think of your commander of logistics. He's got all this stuff to keep one nature of equipment going, and then he's just been asked to look after another one as well. It's like having a rental car company that deals in Ford, and you've got everything set up for Ford, and you've got all your spare parts for Ford, and then someone says, "Oh, and I want you to look after this massive batch of Toyota as well." I mean, it's a huge burden on the logistic chain, and we've seen, just as Ukraine have been very good at these anti-tank teams actually destroying the tanks, they've also been really good at having the confidence to allow tank columns to come past them, so they can then attack the logistic columns behind. And so we've seen those tanks that have survived. Some have run out of fuel, others have just broken down, and hence we've seen all these images of Ukrainian farmers dragging these things away off the battlefield, to great effect. I mean, the numbers are staggering in terms of the losses. So the fact that we're now seeing T-62 pushed into the fight, I think, speaks volumes about the state of the Russian war machine. And let's not forget who's going to crew these things. It's very, very rare that a tank gets knocked out by an anti-tank weapon and the crew survive. It's normally an unsurvivable event Okay, so some of them are breaking down, and the crew are getting off and running back, and fine. So they can go and jump in another tank. But an anti-tank round that comes in generally through the turret of a Russian tank, we've seen time and time again, it's setting off the ammunition inside. Russian tanks have a carousel, an auto loader, a carousel of ammunition and rounds. So it's largely exposed in Western tanks, we have them under sort of armoured charge bins, so there is some protection should there be a sudden arrival of high explosive into the turret from the sides or above or below. Whereas in Russia, we've seen a lot of turrets being blown off the tanks, and that's because the ammunition inside has suddenly gone up. So the anti-tank round comes in. It's normally a jet of molten copper going at about 2,000 or 3,000 miles an hour, and it just blasts through any armour that's in its way. And the sudden increase in pressure and temperature brought about by that jet will set off the ammunition that's inside the tank. And so it's not the actual anti-tank round that's caused these turrets to pop off. It's the effect on all the ammunition inside that suddenly then ignites, and we see the T-72 turret throwing competition all over Ukraine. So these tanks are not going to be crewed by experienced tankies. Probably they will be younger, possibly conscript service personnel put into these T-62s. They've probably not worked much together. They've probably certainly not worked alongside other tanks to any great degree, and they haven't worked alongside all the other arms, all the other bits and pieces of the combined arms orchestra to make it work. So, yeah, we see T-62 going in, and I say that's not great because it's extra tanks, but equally we've just got to look at what does that mean and what's the likely effect going to be. I'll just take a pause there.
Thanks, Dom. That was again that was hugely in depth. I think just what we needed. Just thinking about the personnel. I mean, you mentioned there that they'll have potentially even conscripts crewing tanks. The one of the qualities of the battle for the Donbas at the moment in the last few days is that it seems to be incredibly fierce and vicious fighting in the region. Could you give a sense of what that would feel like to a sort of normal infantryman, potentially a conscript? What are the sights and sounds? What would they be seeing around them? How would they know where to get their orders from? Would they be aware of the greater strategy at play, or as an infantryman, are you just stuck in your foxhole and told to retreat, told to advance, and most of the day you just hear a ton of artillery? What might it be like for the soldiers out there?
Yeah, so most of the time, operations in combat is fairly dull. Combat is large periods of not a lot happening, punctuated by short moments of absolute terror, and so it's largely routine. And it's amazing that you can find humour in these moments, because it just becomes a routine. You look at your ration packs and it's go, what have we got today? Oh, the same old thing again, and this drags on for ages, and then operations kick off, and you'll hear a lot of soldiers say, the training just kicked in, which is good. You want the training to kick in. You want someone to have had a lot of training for it to be able to kick in, because when in the intense moments when you're under the most stress, it largely comes down to as far as you can see. So you will be given your orders from above, and depending how high up the military chain you are, you'll have sort of an awareness or an interest in the bigger picture, and that sort of boils right down to when you're in your small section or your individual tank or what have you. You might have an idea about the much bigger idea, but really you're looking at the piece of real estate in front of you, and you're dealing with the immediate problem to your front. And it can be really intense. It's confusing. It's shocking. It's very, very noisy. It doesn't smell good because it's battlefield obscurance. It's all that's. It's a very alien environment. So the closer that's able to be replicated in training, the better. I mean, in the British Army, elsewhere, I'm sure, have the same this expression of train hard, fight easy. Never really comes down to that, to be perfectly honest. But you want the hard bits, or sufficiently hard bits to be done in training, so that when you then make that extra step up to combat, it's not such a leap that you are overwhelmed. That you're physically frozen and psychologically frozen. You've got to be able to keep thinking and communicating and keep an awareness of what's going on around you. So it'll be chaotic. It would largely come down to shouting to each other. Certainly in the urban environment, radio communications don't work brilliantly well in built-up areas and rubberized cities. So it largely comes down to word of mouth and shouting, and it becomes a very low-level battle. This is why you need a professional, dedicated, motivated non-commissioned officer corps for all the value officers you bring, and planners, staff planners, and headquarters, and all the rest of it. You need that spine, that stiffened resolve of the NCOs, the sergeants, the corporals, the warrant officers. They're actually giving succour and confidence to the people around them, and being able to keep their head. The wise old Bede who may only be in his mid-30s, but the wise old head that will keep the young bucks in check when all they want to do is curl up and hide. So the more you have that professional army, the more you have that professional core of NCOs, then the stronger a military will be, stronger the army will be. And I think we've seen from what we've seen in coming out of Bucha and Irpin in the Kyiv suburbs, Russia just don't have that discipline. They don't have that sort of humanity, such that when it comes to when push comes to shove on the battlefield, they're just not able to maintain that resolve. It seems to be slightly different from the Ukrainian side. However, the more they are relying on civilians or sort of civilian militia, then the less they have all these sort of values and these characteristics and this training inculcated in them. So it's a bit of a they can balance each other out. Russia have great numbers of largely ill-disciplined and poorly trained people. Ukraine have much smaller numbers of people, but they're highly motivated, fighting for their homeland, which had steel to the sinew. But they are very small in number.
Just a final one final question on that, because one of the interesting things, of course, about the battle for the Donbas is we think primarily an artillery war, with the Russians creeping forward slowly behind their heavy artillery. And as you said before, the success of the Ukrainian armed forces in the north has been to push the Russian artillery back so that they couldn't shell Kharkiv. Has there been much military experience across Europe since the Second World War, really, of that kind of massed artillery barrage, that kind of fighting? And I imagine it's quite difficult to train for that. No, that if this hasn't, I imagine you can do training for urban combat, but how do you? What's the how do you prepare psychologically for being under fire, under heavy artillery for day after day, week after week?
Well, I mean, it's very difficult. Is the short answer. I mean, the thing about artillery is that they've always said that the most casualties occur in the first 10 seconds. It's that shock of having this high explosive arrive on your position before you're able to take cover. And just the psychological impact of that, let alone the physical degradation that a force would experience. But it's very, very difficult to train for that shock. I mean, this is why a lot of military training involves flashbangs, so grenades that just create sort of noise and maybe big flash and possibly smoke grenades and what have you, to try and instill in you all the shock that you'd experience, because I mean, we've all seen it. We've all jumped when, in normal everyday life, let alone military experience. But it can seize you. It can overtake. You can be overtaken by these unexpected and unwanted emotions and feelings. And it's easy. It's very human to then unknowingly retreat into our sort of caveman stance and want to look after yourself and crawl into a smaller ball as possible and get out of the way of the nasty big noisy thing in front of you. So it's to overcome that is not natural, and that's why you have to try and replicate this shocking environment in training, such that you're not paralysed when it comes to the day of the race. But it is very, very difficult to do. We've seen nothing on this scale in Europe since the Second World War. I mean, the wars in the Balkans did contain artillery. There was artillery fire, and they were nasty, brutal wars, but nothing on this scale. I mean, we have to look to the Gulf One in the early 90s, to a certain extent Gulf Two, 2003, to get anything on this scale. But but even then, I think it would be going some. Gulf 1 almost certainly, but no, there's been nothing like this in mainland Europe since the Second World War.
So before we move on to some questions from our listeners, can I just ask you to talk about how you think that this battle for the Donbas is going to change in the next few days? What should our listeners be listening out for? What are the big moments that will decide what happens in the next week?
So it looks likely that the city of Severodonetsk will be encircled. The town to the south of that, Popasna, Russia have pushed west from there and are looking as if they might link up or push through a town called Lyman to the north of Popasna. So this is west of Severodonetsk, and that would seal off that little pocket. That Severodonetsk salient, as we've been referring to. That would mean the whole of the Luhansk Oblast, the northernmost oblast of the Donbas, is in Russian control. And I think at that point there will be a pause. I think there will be a desire, maybe even a demand from Putin to push west as far as possible, get to the Dnieper River, the river that runs north-south through Ukraine and largely splits the country in half. But Russia just simply won't be able to do it. Their forces will be exhausted. They haven't got the personnel. They're having to widen the age of conscription in Russia to bring up more manpower. So I think they will culminate. Culmination is a military term, which means when you can no longer carry on offensive action. It doesn't mean that you're being pushed back, but it means you can't go forward. So they will transition onto the defence. They will start physically digging in, and as we've seen around the south, around Kherson, they will try to start physically building emplacements, defensive positions. But I think any attempt to try and push west quickly will not be possible. I think they will need another few weeks of reconstitution again, that reorganisation and rest and recuperation before they can do major combat operations again. There is a chance, bearing in mind that Putin's war aims shifted. He originally wanted the whole country to denazify and get rid of all the drug dealers and whatever else he came up with. Then changed to the Donbas and the Russian-speaking people there need liberation. So if he was able to take Luhansk and maybe even the rest of the Donetsk Oblast, there is a chance he might say, right, now let's go into negotiations. Of course, both sides will only go into negotiations unless they have to. They will only choose to go into negotiations when they feel that they're in a strong position and they feel they will get more from negotiating than they will by fighting. So you might find that at that point Putin says, well, we should negotiate, and that's when all these issues that I mentioned right at the very start about these ideas about what do you cede land for peace, or do you say no, we've got to keep fighting, this is the future of this is going to point the way for the 21st century. Do you keep fighting? So I think there's a possibility. I think there will be a pause, but I don't think that will be out of choice. I think Russia will want to keep pressing west. I don't think there will be serious noises about negotiations. I think Ukraine, who have shown themselves very able and willing, confident to give up land in order to fight in a better time and place of their choosing, as harsh as it is to give up some towns and villages that are going to be pulverized and probably brutalized by the Russian forces. But I think they have shown a resolve to do that. So I think at that point, I think if Russia are able to take this salient, then there will be a pause whilst both sides take stock, because Ukraine are losing a lot of people as well, losing equipment and personnel. And I think that at that point it would be very interesting to see what these calls are from the West, to see if these noises from sort of Italy, Hungary and others to go for negotiations, whether or not they start to really bed in, or whether the counter to that, mainly from sort of Poland and the US and UK and the Nordic, Scandinavian countries, Baltics, to say, no, we will keep supplying, we will keep training, we will keep providing humanitarian aid and money to keep Ukraine in the fight. I think there'll be a pause there, and then the politics will sort of point the way for the next chapter.
Well, thanks for that summary. Let's have a look at some listener questions. We've got a question, I believe it's from Bo, about drones, and she talks about listening to a feature on drone operators in Afghanistan, and there's a bit of a revelation that drones can be operated from so far away that you can control a drone flying over enemy territory from a base 6,000 miles away. Her question then is, would it be possible for other countries to secretly assist Ukraine through drone operation? And how would Russia know that was happening? And do you think that would be a possibility?
Yeah, okay, so Bo, thanks for the question. So these drones that we're talking about, the big strategic drones like Reaper, Predator, the big ears that were armed with anti-tank weapons, they are... in the US, largely controlled out of Creech Air Force Base in Nevada. In the UK, they're flown out of RAF Waddington, Lincolnshire. These are satellite-controlled airframes. They do have to have a launch and recovery element and a ground control station near the theatre, so they can't take off and land themselves. The ones coming in at the moment, the Reaper replacement that in the UK we're going to be calling Protector, but it goes under different names. General Atomics make Reaper and make this air vehicle as well, but we're going to call it Protector. And these aircraft can take off, so they can be controlled from your base, and they can take off and then come back to conduct their mission and come back, all without this ground control element in theatre. But what they are good at is they have long loiter times, and they can stay aloft for hours on end, days on end, and have weapons on board. Obviously, the more weapons you have, the shorter your loiter time is. But they are very, very big. They can see a lot. They've got great cameras, and they can do a lot about a problem if they see one. But they're looking through a drinking straw, so they have no great situational awareness. They can pinpoint stuff on the ground. They have to be put onto it by other intelligence assets, but they can see a spot on the ground. But that's about it. They don't have great wide area visibility. Some drones do with synthetic area radars. They can sort of take a view of the ground through clouds and other obscurants. But the kind of armed drones, they can't. They need a clear day to be able to see what's going on. And then they've got no defensive aid. So I mean, they can be spotted. They have small radar cross sections, but they can be spotted nonetheless, and they can be shot down. They don't have any weapons on them for their own self protection. So even though they are very capable, they need a permissive air environment to be able to operate, i.e. you don't want anyone shooting back at you, essentially is what that means. So it would be very unwise, to the point that it, unlikely, it's just not going to happen, that the US and the UK would secretly fly these things over Ukraine to assist in the fight against Russian tanks. Because firstly, as I say, the ones in service at the moment have to be launched from nearby, so they would be seen. And secondly, the chances of them being shot down or just crashing, and the propaganda goldmine that would offer to Russia to say this is NATO taking a direct part in the fight, it just would not be worth it. And what they're able to do, the drones, is being conducted by very effectively by Ukrainian anti-tank teams at the moment. So yeah, every little bit helps, but I just don't think it would be worth. It certainly wouldn't be worth the political risk, and I think it would add very little militarily to try and get these things in there in an anti-tank role, if you like. Now, having said that, so I'll just finish this, Dave, by saying that if you look at flight tracker radars, such as Flight Radar 24, and there's loads of others out there, you can see around the borders, on the NATO borders, you can see all sorts of NATO aircraft doing laps, circuits up and down, having a good look inside Ukraine and Russia and Belarus. So you'll be able to see that there are a lot of aircraft active, and I mean they have said, the British MOD and the Pentagon have said that they are working with Ukrainian partners. So I think there's a lot of airborne assets that are being, if not made available to Ukraine, then certainly the product from those assets are being used by Ukraine. Not weapons, but certainly the intelligence that's derived from the platforms.
Well, thank you both very much for your question, and thanks, Dom, for your answer. We've got one from Steve here. Again, I think you've touched on it in a couple of your answers, but it might be nice to bring some ideas together. He asks, from the Ukrainian perspective, what could they do strategically next? What's their best approach to winning the war? Where are the Russians most vulnerable, and how could that vulnerability be best exploited?
Yeah, I mean, winning is such a loaded term. At the base level, you mean defeat the opposition, push them out of your territory. I mean, that's very hard for Ukraine to do. So, in terms of a political win, if you like, we've said how Russia has already lost this war in terms of Putin's made himself and his country global pariahs. They've been cut off from the international landscape. I mean, they're kept alive because they are massive energy exporters. But really, it's going to be a long time before Russia is brought back into the international fold. Interesting comments from Henry Kissinger the other day saying, "Don't forget, Russia's a great power, pivotal to European security." I wonder if that's going to change in light of what's happened here. But in terms of what Ukraine can do, I mean, simply staying in the fight has been astounding, and has made, if it's not made Russia think again, it will certainly have raised questions in the minds of, I would have thought, the Chinese leadership as they look at Taiwan, looking at this surprisingly coherent international resolve against this brutality. I think that will give autocrats pause for thought. The way that the military, in terms of supplying weapons to Ukraine, was knitted together with the diplomacy and the economics and the societal support, I think that has come as a surprise to many, and not just in Russia and China. I think it's come as a surprise to many other people as well. So, what can Ukraine do to win? It depends what you mean by winning, and I don't mean to fudge the question here. But if you take it as pushing all Russian troops off their soil, so completely out of Ukraine and out of Crimea, that they need a lot more people in their armed forces, a lot better trained, and they need a lot more equipment, all of which takes time. So I'm not saying we're not there, and I'm not saying there isn't the resolve to do that, but it will take years to train a force. You're basically building an army to be able to do that. In the short term, I think the supply of very sophisticated munitions from the West is, it's certainly helping to hold the Russians back in some areas and even push them back. It was the resolve and the fighting spirit that pushed Russia out of the north of the country and around Kharkiv. But the supply of arms, although secondary, was still very, very important. So that needs to continue. Western powers need to decide if they're in it for the long term, as Poland and US and UK to a lesser degree, but certainly Poland have come out and said, "Yep, we're not going anywhere." I think the more that those countries are able to stand up and be counted, the more chance there is of this. Even if it does degrade into, or does move to negotiations, then the chances of going back to the pre-February the 24th borders, so with the Russian separatist movements in power in the east of the Donbas, that would be a loss for Putin. That would be seen as a military defeat for him. So if I'm not being too much like a politician and trying to change the question slightly and say, instead of winning, what would imposing defeat look like? I think that would be a defeat for Putin if he was forced to accept where the line of control was on February the 23rd, albeit that included Crimea. I think that would be counted as a defeat for Putin and ergo a victory for Ukraine.
Thanks, Dom. And just a final question from Iris. She asked this a few days ago, but I think it's probably a good idea to bring it up. She's asking about POWs, so prisoners of war. Do we know much more about the treatment, the number, where they are, of both sides? Can we say much yet? I mean, obviously the fog of war is descended in the Donbas, but what can we say about the situation of the prisoners of war on both sides?
Well, we don't know a huge amount. It's loaded with legal implications. So we journalists have to be very, very careful about asking too much or trying to interview prisoners of war, trying to get access to them and so on and so forth. The organisation that does is the International Committee of the Red Cross. Under the Geneva Conventions, the ICRC can have access, unfettered access and unmonitored access to prisoners of war. They have said they have done that on at least one occasion for the Ukrainian soldiers that came out of the Azovstal plant. They were taken, if you may remember, the wounded soldiers were taken about 10 k's further east along the coast to another area, still in Russian separatist-held part of Ukraine, but they were held there in a hospital, and all the other fighters were taken about 50 k's north, near to Donetsk city itself. So still not in Russia proper, but taken to camps there where they were visited by ICRC. So we don't know exact numbers on either side, and we don't know if and how many have been taken back to Russia proper. The only real comment we had was, as I mentioned earlier on, from Deputy Foreign Minister Andrei Rudenko, who's talking about prisoner swaps after an appropriate time of appropriate number of convictions and sentencing. So that was the first time we've heard anything from Russia. From Ukrainian side, we saw the trial of the Russian soldier who shot the 62-year-old Ukrainian man. I mean, I'm looking at my notes here, and I'm looking at the guy's name, but his name is known to history, but he doesn't deserve to be remembered. So I'm not going to say his name. The man he killed was Alexander Shelepov. His name does deserve to be remembered. So I'm sorry if it's a bit stunted here, but I'm very conscious. I don't like to repeat the names of the perpetrators because they just need to shuffle off into history, and we should remember the victims. But he was put into a court process under the rule of law. Now, Russia will say, that was completely biased. You can decide for yourself. I personally think that the court proceedings were appropriate, and he was handed down a life sentence. So that was in relation to alleged war crimes, and that process is ongoing. And the UN are very heavily involved on the ground investigating war crimes. And so there may be some more of those trials. But in terms of prisoners of war camps as well, we don't know the exact nature of them, the locations and numbers. But they should, if they're adhering to the Geneva Conventions, as they should do, then they should be well outside the combat zone. They should be free from abuse and degrading treatment, dehumanising treatment. They should be fed and watered to the same degree as the guards looking after them. And yes, they should be given unfettered access by the ICRC.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, and thank you, Iris Crofty, for that question. I think we've probably come to the end of our time. Dom, thank you so much for your time. You've really held these last 45 minutes up on your own two shoulders, an atlas of knowledge and analysis there. Do you have any final thoughts to leave our listeners with, to look for? What should they be looking for over the next few days?
Well, I'll just say, we're talking about the Severodonetsk pocket as if it's inevitable that it's going to collapse. We said this about Mariupol, and okay, I know Mariupol there are no Ukrainian forces there anymore, but it took months before that fell, and what the Ukrainian forces in this salient, in the Severodonetsk salient, are doing now is holding up Russia. A mile a day is woeful for a military, and whilst they are advancing, you've always got to bear in mind the relative cost. If they are having to increase the bracket of age group for people that can be called up into the Russian army, if they're having to dig T-62 tanks out of the sheds and fill them full of barely trained fighters, this does not speak well for them. And the longer that the Ukrainian forces can hold onto that pocket, the more they are wearing these forces down. And so I think there will be, you've got to keep an eye on that. And I think what happens after that will speak volumes about the next chapter in this war.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Phil Atkins. And today on Twitter, Sophie Coe.